Hello, welcome to this program today. Today, we're going to be unpacking self-storage for you. My name is Daniel J. Boorstein. My company is SBI Properties, LLC. Here's my contact information for those at the beginning of the end. To start with, I want to introduce a little bit about myself. My name is, again, Daniel Boorstein. I go by Dan. I have about 35 years in commercial real estate development, management, consulting, and brokerage experience. I was born and raised in Chicago. I graduated undergrad from the University of Michigan. I participated in some specialized studies afterwards at Harvard and in Florence, Italy. And while I was working, which we'll go through in a bit in some of my experience, I got an MBA at DePaul. One interesting background as I was looking for an MBA, I was interviewing at the University of Chicago. My wife attended there, my brother, my sister, my brother-in-law. I had an interview in depth for an MBA spot. And during that MBA interview, they wanted to hear why I wanted to go to school. I had an LS&A background from the University of Michigan, and all I kept talking about was the storage business. And I wanted to know more about business, to be more in the storage business. They weren't too impressed. I went and got a very fine education at DePaul. So I'm going to give a shout out to them. Back in the late 1980s, I started a commercial real estate firm in Chicago together with my father. We had a three-phase practice. We had small offices, retail center, and we're really focused on a new generation of self-storage. During the 1990s, we struggled during the transition of that era. We'll talk about that era during this presentation a little bit. In the 1990s, I moved here to Detroit, and I had 10 years working in some very unique and high-profile commercial real estate projects in Detroit and the suburbs. Back around post 9/11, I went back to the future, decided to get back into self-storage, and I also got involved in other industrial assets. And in my career, self-storage is like the self-storage hokey pokey. I've been in and out of the industry from the era of big hair all the way through today, which is the era of big data. So enough about me, let's move on and talk about the industry. So in today's presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about the evolution of self-storage, going to talk about self-storage, the definitions and segmentation of the asset class. I'll give you a snapshot of the US market, give you a little history of the industry in the US, which is a little different than the status of the market today. And then some other history, which is my history, and a little bit of the development pattern that I followed that mirrors some of the historical events that happened in the industry. So in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, a lot of different eras. And in every different era, I can tell you this, there was always a time when everybody knew a cousin, a brother, a friend who had an investment in self-storage. It was kind of like the Bitcoin and non-fungible tokens of the era, but with a little less mystery versus what those things are, because people understood storage was real estate. But there always seems to be a lot of questions and a little bit of mystery still to self-storage, and hopefully I'm going to unpack some of that here today. So first, let's do a little myth busting about self-storage and some of the things that people say or think and what some of the truths are. So self-storage is used only by people living in apartments. And the truth of that is really the highest percentage of users in self-storage are single-family homeowners, which always comes to a surprise to many people, even in today's world. Self-storage is rented primarily by low and moderate income customers. That's not true either. Self-storage is found to be a universal demand event along all income demographics. It tends to actually perform better when you're in the higher household income areas. Self-storage is recession-proof. This is somewhat true, somewhat not true. We found that self-storage is really recession-resistant, much more so than other commercial real estate categories. During the Great Recession, as we'll talk about in a later segment, self-storage was really badly hurt, but not as great as housing and office and other sectors. But in the COVID era, on the flip side, storage thrived like it never has before. Again, we'll get to that later. Storage is just dead warehousing for individuals. Again, not true. The storage business is actually a very, very highly dependent mobile highly dependent on mobility. The movement of people from place to place is one of the key elements that drives self-storage. It's a hybrid, really, of an apartment building, a hotel, and retail property. So while people think of it as dead warehousing, it's actually very active. Lastly, everyone thinks there's an expert in storage because they've seen Storage Wars on TV. The truth is, of course, Storage Wars is completely fake news. They stage that show. And when it comes to storage and auctions that people are familiar with, the better run properties don't want to have auctions or have very few auctions. It's really a way to clear the space out and not something that you want to pursue as a self-storage operator. So moving into where storage and how it became to be. So back in the 16 to 1800s, there was shipping and warehousing in England that eventually moved its way to become what they called in England as English vaults. English bank vaults were personal individual storage, even though they call them bank vaults. So in England, the warehouses became known as public warehouses. That became the nomenclature of the day. And from England, it jumped the pond over to the United States after being around in the late 1800s, and eventually landed in the US. And primarily some of the first warehousing operations were operated by Beacon's company. Beacon's was actually out of Idaho, or Iowa, excuse me. They were in Iowa, but their first warehouses were out in LA, corresponding with being out by the ports. But Beacon's was one of the first storage operators in the country. In the 1920s and 1930s, warehousing had large footprints, multi-level designs, and they were very similar to what the English called their public warehouses, as you just saw the photo just previously. When you morphed into the 1940s and 50s, the warehousing in the upper right-hand corner here, it was flatter and designed to better accommodate truck access off of ports. And you can see the warehouse up against the water over there and the accessibility of the driver ports in the front. By the 1950s and 60s, warehouses started moving, morphing into smaller footprints, number one, moving away from ports and placing warehouses more in residential areas, both in the cities and the outer suburban rings. By the time the 1950s to the early 1960s, residential individual storage needs started really increasing as there was a lot more moving. Americans were moving to the suburbs and they were moving up and out from the cities, and there was more and more need for warehousing space. So by the late 60s, we got into an area of what I call peace, love, and self-storage. And I have a picture here, which may have been one of the very early self-storage operations. Storage was built primarily in areas near Army bases, as well as near residential bases down in the South. And some of the first users of self-storage were troops that were leaving overseas to go to Vietnam. Now I'm going to go through some of the definitions and segmentation of the asset class. So what exactly is self-storage versus a warehouse? It's almost indistinguishable. As you look at this picture, you can look and say, is this a storage project or is this a warehouse? So sometimes it's easier to understand what something is when you know what it isn't. And one of the things self-storage is not is this pod or mobile containers. And everyone, I think, has seen some familiarity with these pods. You see the large delivery systems that are necessary to bring a pod to a house. And you see the equipment necessary to lift pods and move pods around. Pods require trucks to bring them back and forth. Their warehousing is, I lost a photo, forgive me. The warehousing, you can see they're in large warehouses and they stack the pods on top of one another. And lastly, there have been some people, U-Haul have tried to combine the pod business together with the self-storage. You can see it in the background here, but it generally has been a separate business, and those in the business don't feel a real competitive strain against pod storage. The other things storage is not, is record files. I missed a photo here. So here's record storage. Primarily paper record files. You can see an individual picking up in a large truck in front of an office building, paper records from Iron Mountain, who is the largest player in the industry. And file storage, as you can see, it's an enormous business into itself. You've got scads of boxes, you need gigantic warehousing space to hold it, but it's not the same thing as self-storage. And it requires people to pick and pull files out of individual boxes. Really, the revenues in the file storage business come from those who pick and pull files off of the shelves and deliver them for a fee to the customer. Record storage business also takes salespeople. Not something generally you need much of in the self-storage business, but you have to have people on the phone constantly selling people. And the file storage business is a little bit different. It tends to work on a one-year contract or longer for those who use it. And file storage, give me a few problems with my PowerPoint. I've missed the last slide, but we'll move on to what storage is as a business. And the primary cornerstone of self-storage is rooted in state statutes, that every state in the United States has its own state statute defining what self-storage is. In Michigan, we have something called the Self-Service Storage Facility Act of 1985. It's been updated a few times, added to, but it essentially says the same thing, that self-storage in a self-storage unit is leased by a tenant primarily for storage space. And a self-storage or self-service, which is the old phrase of calling it self-service storage facility, means any property designed or used leasing individual storage space to tenants who have access to that space for the purpose of storing and removing personal property. As simplistic as this is, baked within these state statutes are some of the key aspects that define self-storage as its own unique business. There are some key points, as I said, distinguishing self-storage from other warehouse or industrial type properties. The first is the notion of care, custody, and control. The tenant keeps a key and lock to the self-storage facility. I know there are some iterations where sometimes people are allowed delivery and such to the units, but the key aspect of storage is the key, is the lock and the key, that the customer has the space and that there's no bailment attached to the items. The customer has the space as a leased space. Customer has a choice of what they're putting in and out of their storage space. The next are lease terms. Self-storage is defined by having a month-to-month lease, generally identified as having a lease no longer than a year. Although customers can stay longer than a year, leases do roll over by term, but generally it's a month-to-month lease, and it can't be written up for longer than a single year. Short-term lien. This is the most crucial aspect of the self-storage business. Without this, the self-storage business doesn't operate. The idea here is that self-storage facilities that have anywhere from, let's say, 100 storage units to upwards of 1,000 storage units, in order to lease those and turn those around, you cannot be acting as a warehouseman, where you have to go to court to get the space back and spend the time and effort to retrieve the spaces. It would tie you up in a court forever if you were a self-storage operator. So every self-storage lien act or self-storage statute in every state provides for the short-term lien rights. That is a critical aspect of how this business works. Without that aspect, the business would collapse, quite literally. It is necessary in order to have the control over the tenants and to create essentially leverage over the tenants to either have them pay or to lose the right to their goods and have those things auctioned off. I go back to the Storage Wars TV show that people are familiar with. And embedded in the short-term lien right and within these acts are legislative language that defines the definition between the tenant and the landlord, and there's rights between tenants and landlords, very similar to a lessee or lessor, like a retail business. Overall, the self-storage model is distinguished by this. It's a commercial real estate asset type. It is not a service like the file record storage, or even the pod business is a service. It's really a pickup and delivery service. Space is leased, subject to ownership rules, depending on time you allow people inside your facility, and it's accessed on demand by the lessee. Self-storage is characterized primarily by low staff utilization and high variable use by the individuals who rent. They make the determination of what they're going to store inside of their storage units, as opposed to file storage, which we know is going to be paper files. So I'm going to get into commercial real estate aspect of self-storage, not just the business aspect, and getting into the facility types. And here we begin as what we call the first generation of self-storage. The first generation of self-storage was built in the 1960s, the 1970s. Many of them are just very old projects, but many of them are still in use today. They're characterized in a market type that's identified as a rural market type. And they were built very simple construction, very minimal site development. You can see the picture here. It shows there's no pavement. It's just barely gravel or unpaved corridors in between these buildings. There's generally no on-site management, little security, if anything, other than a lock on the door. Again, the key of the customer keeps the lock and key. They don't offer any ancillary services. They might have some boat and RV storage out back. Generally very low land costs. It's in a rural area and outside of main development. Very little maintenance by the ownership, generally located in fields or older industrial parks. Again, I want to emphasize, and we'll get into this a little bit later into this presentation, that there are still many of these first generation facilities that still exist. So now we move into the second generation facility. This was predominantly built in the 1980s, and even in today's world, many people are building still these second generation type facilities. It is by far the predominant style of self-storage. Often it's referred to as row garage. And by the photo that you see here, you can see from the overview, they're just built as row garages. You can build them in a couple of different formats and different sizes and different shapes, which is one of the benefits of self-storage. It's actually very malleable as a development type because it can be placed on different size properties, different shape properties. They also, on occasion, you can see have gone up 2 levels on this picture on the bottom right. So some of the characterization of this second generation, generally found in suburban markets. The construction is generally metal, concrete, and steel. These properties are identified and characterized more by a higher level of computer security gates and controls, where people have access codes to get onto the property as opposed to being open. There's generally outdoor lighting for security and enclosed with fences. The majority of the properties are generally drive-up access with no climate-controlled provisions. They're generally just sheds with no kind of protection inside the sheds. Asphalt or stone drives. There's oftentimes boat and RV storage in separate yards adjacent to the property. Sometimes they're 2 levels, mostly 1 level. Oftentimes the 2-level properties, again, referencing the picture on the bottom right, came with topography. There was a lot of people who were buying land, particularly in the 80s, with rough topography, and it was one way to take a piece of property that traditionally would cost money for grading and leveling and finding a way to build on the property as it existed. Generally, they have direct or sometimes indirect access off of main roads. A little bit more about second generation facilities. They were built with better quality, primarily to allow for better accessibility for vehicles, with the asphalt allowing for trucks. The ones that were not built with actual roads, you can imagine in the wintertime and wet conditions, it was difficult to get access to the storage spaces. Oftentimes there's ancillary sales services. In this particular case, there's propane sales and sometimes some small retail sales, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner. Generally, these second generation facilities have on-site management sales offices, which include a small area of retail. And oftentimes, particularly the earlier second generation facilities, the offices were paired together with an upper level or sometimes lower level management apartment. The idea was to hire a management couple, and as part of their compensation is they would live on site. So they would act almost as caretakers, giving a level of perceived security to these facilities. But it was also a way to keep down costs in the earlier days for the development of the properties and lower income production, where you would qualify the apartment as part of their compensation. There was some negative aspects to that, as people learn later on, in that if you had a resident couple that you had to fire, you were also evicting them from their home, and that could be a tricky business. And over time, that sort of fell out of favor. So we moved from that to this, which becomes the third generation. The third generation was really started to be developed in the mid-1990s to current day, characterized by high quality retail-like locations. Generally, the multi-story ones were climate controlled, and more they have gone vertical. As people have been trying to penetrate locations that are more expensive, it only makes more sense for it to go up instead of buying more land to go out. Third generation, generally found in more urban markets, much more sophisticated construction and higher quality materials. As I mentioned already, multi-story, climate controlled with oftentimes interior access to the spaces, high focus on property aesthetics. That became an issue in part to achieve zoning approval in many of these locations. Communities didn't want the old looking storage, row garage types of facilities to be popping up in retail areas or near residential areas. As I said, here, oftentimes you have unique or hybrid zoning required to just build them in certain locations. One of the negatives of this is the multi-story eliminates the boat and RV storage. Generally, there's not enough land area to accommodate that, nor are the facilities built high enough generally to accommodate inside boat and RVs. Significantly higher land costs in the third generation. That was one of the primary issues for pushing on the vertical. The third generation often comes with much more sophisticated management and generally more centralized management, where the managers on site are really customer focused and are producing reports and communicating with a third party off-site management control command central that is sometimes even taking phone calls and allowing customers, managers to interact with customers who walk in the front door. Oftentimes there's value-added services. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Many people offer free truck usage. Sometimes there's pickup and delivery services. That's primarily the way they operate storage facilities in New York City. It's too difficult for people to arrange for truck usage themselves and gain access to storage. So in New York, it's become more the predominant model. Sometimes there's indoor car storage. Some people have morphed to wine storage and some other unique aspects in these higher level facilities. As we move on, there's a next generation of facilities that's starting to come to the marketplace. And that is characterized in a few different areas. First, there's adaptive reuse. The adaptive reuse model, in this particular case, you can see is a climate-controlled self-storage facility. And I think it's fairly obvious this was at one time an auto dealership, which has been redeveloped here as a self-storage facility. And go back to adaptive reuse. I think I missed a picture. Here's an adaptive reuse of a big box. Big box retail has become more of the, particularly Kmart's here in Detroit, people have seen more of the traditionally seen adaptively reused purposing of self-storage, which lends well for these multi-story climate controlled. Oftentimes the big boxes have a high enough ceiling to allow for at least 2 levels of development inside of the property. I've already shown you this one. So some of the other types of generations of storage that are starting to come to the forefront is mixed use. In this particular case, this is a mixed use property that was planned as both self-storage, and if you note on the right side of the picture, actually with bulk warehouse operations associated with it. So the front glass portion of this was actually self-storage. So the self-storage was self-contained in this area, and the left side area and the right side area is more of a bulk warehouse. More traditional in mixed use is a combination of putting mixed use with some limited retail space, generally convertible. There have been many different iterations of a combination of retail with self-storage. On the sales end of the self-storage, the buyers of self-storage generally want self-storage to be a standalone independent use. So when the retail is put in, it's either number one, a requirement of zoning in the particular community, or an aspect to gain favor for rezoning, or it is a strategy for putting in some early cash flowing use, because self-storage is a slow to lease up and high cost to deploy project. The notion of putting in retail in the beginning can goose your pro forma and goose your cash flow by putting that in. More often than not, the owners of self-storage with retail want it to be flexible. So at some juncture, when the self-storage becomes well populated and popular in an area, they can expand and take out the retail square footage and convert it into more storage. There have even been options of mixed use self-storage with residential. This is one project actually in Boston, bit of an odd project where they're taking some space that they didn't feel was well situated or well leasing for residential purposes, and they're repurposing that into self-storage, and the residential is winging down the street. This is probably the greatest of the next generation, which is robotic and automated properties. This particular photo, this is of a real storage operation in England, and having one of these robotic mobile units that guides people to their units, actually creates the rental unit, the rental agreement, and guides the people around and doesn't require an on-site manager. There are more robotic operations. This is out east. This is a true robotic self-storage, no human interaction whatsoever. It is all robotic, and this operates, as you can see with the equipment on the right, where it actually lifts like a mobile pod your storage unit and racks it up into a particular set location in the property. I can't say that this next generation is going to be prevalent. There's an awfully high cost implication for getting involved in these, but the reduction of on-site management is definitely more of a trend going on in the storage business, and seeing more of the kiosks and robotic help inside of the facility is more of the wave of the future. So self-storage as an investment is looked at and broken down in several different manners, and it's analyzed by those that look at it as investment in several different segment categories. First, by use. So roughly 80% of the users of self-storage use it for personal use, which on the backside means 20% is roughly people using it for business purposes. Inventories, I can't say that you're really allowed to put offices in there the way this is shown, but I have had a customer who does use it for an office, but there's roughly 20% that use it for business purposes. Self-storage is categorized by the sizes of the spaces. So self-storage is broken down in 5 and 10 foot increments. So the spaces are either a 5 by 5, 5 by 10, 10 by 10. This is a measurement of the size of space. So it's very much a cookie cutter model broken up in 5 and 10 foot increments. And in today's world, this distribution shows you the popularity and the distribution of space that actually exists around the country. By far, your most common storage space size is a 10 by 10 unit, followed by a 10 by 20, which is approximately the size of a one-car garage. And you can see as you go down that list where all of the sizes fit. When you're analyzing self-storage, many people often look and ask what their 10 by 10 rate is immediately to understand what their average rate will be in a self-storage unit. Next is by term. People look at self-storage properties in terms of how long their existing leases are running. Short term is considered to be under 3 months. Medium term, 3 to 6 months, or 7 to 12, when you're talking about more of a commercial user, would be higher skewed on the 7 to 12. And then longer term, 1 to 2 year tenancies. And this is the analyst, part of the analyzation done by people who are looking to buy these things, and they want to understand the basis of the current tenant occupancy. It can give some clue as to how the property has been run. In a perfect world, you really want these things to balance out. You want to have essentially your property to be divided among these three category of terms. You want to have about a third of your spaces be a short term, about a third medium term, and about a third long term. That's a very healthy storage project when you have that kind of a balance in your property. And they're also, of course, analyzed by layout. We've talked a little bit here about the traditional row garage type of layout. This is more of a second generation layout, traditional straight aisles, very nice, clean, non-climate controlled, everything very uniform. You can see over time, I mentioned the topography that some people took on in the 1980s, primarily when they had difficult to build on sites, or if you're in a more mountainous state where you get these types of facilities. Self-storage operators and developers have been clever in developing two stories, where one story on the lower level is accessed on the lower level, the other story is accessed on the upper level. Over time, people have taken these things and improved them. So you have, in this particular case, you've got a facility in the lower level, which is a non-climate controlled type storage unit. And you can see the heat and air conditioning units there on the driveway servicing the upper level, creating climate controlled space on the upper level part of the property. And as time wore on, you can see here is more of a traditional self-storage. You can see the traditional row garage, non-climate controlled building, and adjacent to it, the newer climate controlled buildings they built, stacked up, again, working with the topography in this particular case, but adding in the windows so people can see the doors from the street. This must have been a photo from the street level. I didn't take this, I found this online, but you can see the evolution of the storage in this particular photo from the sort of old school row garage, non-climate controlled storage next to your two-story climate control. And then, of course, leading to more of your third generation, where you have multi-story here serviced by, in this particular case, an adjacent pull inside area, where's the common access area for the storage facility. Last segmentation is by market. We've discussed the market segmentation a little bit. Rural market, generally defined as Class C product, low security, minimal amenities. Suburban product, Class B and C, with outdoor boat and RV, sometimes limited climate control in these suburban types of properties. Urban would be Class A or B. It'd be more Class B if it was a rehab type property. If you've taken an older property and tried to rehab it, you wouldn't necessarily qualify that as a Class A multi-story facility. Oftentimes those rehabs don't even come with full climate control. Sometimes they're older warehouses and they put in some hanging heaters to create some level of heat, but not necessarily air conditioned space. And then lastly is the ex-urban, mixture between suburban and urban, where you're finding the mixed uses, the adaptive reuses. This would be the redeveloped big boxes and other types. Sometimes they're brand new developments. I've engaged in these ex-urban ones where you're putting in some of the aspects of an urban property, primarily going vertical, a little bit tighter site, into an area that's a little bit more suburban. Again, that's the name ex-urban. Again, as an investment, there are some other additional revenues and niches that self-storage operators, not all, but many have gotten into. And some of the ones that are more popular and more of the ex-urban, closer to rural type properties, you'll find people who have refuelable fuel tanks for propane that is sold on site. Of course, selling tenant insurance has become a very popular thing in the last several years. It's become something that's been at first outlawed and now regulated and approved on a state-by-state basis. The problem with insurance previously was insurance was regulated and separately licensed. Many states have gone in and amended their self-storage statutes to allow self-storage managers to sell insurance across the counter. So it no longer requires a separate licensing. Most states now have that, and it's become very, very much the norm in the self-storage business. Expanded and enhanced retail. Many operators are really focusing on their offices and expanding their retail presence to really make it more like a retail store and more inviting. Indoor car storage. I've engaged in this in some of my properties where you put in some minimal racking in order to raise cars up and double stack and allow either individuals to store, or in this particular case, this is more of an open joint facility for people to store cars inside. And wine storage has become popular in some higher end suburban areas where they've blocked out certain units and created areas that are segregated for wine storage with additional security. And also the wine storage has to come with some kind of, besides heat and air control, it has to have humidity control, and it has to have several systems to make sure that the wines are protected. Lastly, in New York, as you can see here, some of the bigger storage facilities have found revenue sourcing from putting on billboards and even adding cell towers. Cell towers is something that even in the suburban and urban facilities, people have found nice revenue streams to add to it. Self-storage, again, as an investment, there's some key investment and asset markers in the self-storage business. The first, this is the most rock cornerstone of self-storage, which is the occupancy. And a self-storage project is considered to be stabilized when it hits 85% occupancy. Now, over the last several years, there's been some discussion and some fudging of numbers trying to determine what is 85% occupied. You determine it by the square footage occupied or by the number of units occupied. And you really have to look at the two of them, because you could have, for example, a storage facility has many large storage units that are occupied, but many small units that are not occupied. So investors look at both square footage and number of units, but they also look at the economic occupancy. As we'll talk about in a minute, there's a strategy of how you lease these things up when they're new properties. And so you want to understand how much revenue is being produced versus what its potential really is. So looking at stabilization by square footage, number of units, and then also by its economic occupancy. But 85% from a bank and investment standpoint is always the key stabilization figure. Next is the lease type. As mentioned earlier, storage is identified and distinguished by its month-to-month leases. Now, besides having month-to-month leases as part of its statutory requirements, self-storage, it's a big help with its tenants. You can help control your tenancy. When you have a property with hundreds of units, it's not uncommon that you're going to have an occasional bad tenant, a difficult tenant, somebody who isn't paying attention to the rules, somebody who's storing something that maybe smells and you want to get rid of. You can control your tenants with the month-to-month occupancy, and you can just tell them you're not renewing your lease. It's perfectly valid, perfectly legal, and you can get them out very quickly. Month-to-month occupancy also allows for fast reaction to the market. As we'll talk about a little bit later, there have been eras in the self-storage business that have had some difficulty. And there have been times where you've had to mark down your rents, or in times like post-COVID, when demand rises very quickly, you can react very quickly and raise your rates very quickly. So it's very favorable for the owner. One negative to the month-to-month is on a selling situation. Buyers of these things have to be very careful to look closely at the leases and at the rent rolls to make sure that there has not been a lot of manipulation. The easiest manipulation that you can find in self-storage is by increasing what's called your street rent. That's the rent that is either advertised online or provided to tenants when they come into the property, and telling them how much each unit leases for. Now that street rent, and you multiply that out tied into your units, may show a gross occupancy, gross potential that's fantastic. But the actual amount what has been charged to previous tenants may be nowhere close to what your street rent is. With computerization, it's been a lot easier to determine those things, but it's not in the late 90s, early 2000s, when people weren't fully computerized. It was easy to manipulate those kinds of things in a self-storage investment. Rent strategies. This is becoming more and more important, particularly with computerization. So in a storage property that is leasing up or in a down market, that's my red arrow here in the down market, discounting of storage rents is your primary way of dealing with strategies of dealing with your property. In a lease up, you're trying to aggregate as many customers as you can. You're offering them a deal to get in. Famously in the industry, people may have heard of Public Storage offering $1 for the first month That was for many years a very famous and well-known marketing strategy to get people to come in and get into storage at a low price point. When the market gets soft, there'll be discounting. People may offer $1 for the first month. They may offer pay your first month, get your second month free. So discounting is an important strategy in both leasing up and in a down market. On the other end is optimization, and that's something that's a little bit newer and a little bit more involved with computerization of storage. When you have a mature property or you're in an up market, as we are post-COVID, optimization is going in and tweaking your rents, going in and raising rents, going in and raising your street rents. On a more modern basis, there's optimization of rents where the rents may change in a property on a daily basis, where you can have either algorithms or have somebody watching it independently watch and see what your street rates are, what your availability is, and altering your pricing on a day-by-day basis is becoming more and more popular out in the industry. And that's something that is a difficult measure to look at as an individual buying a self-storage property, to really understand what they're getting and what their real rents are, because things are changing so quickly, particularly with the internet and the availability of computerization and online. Moving to technology, another area that is becoming one of the biggest identifiers and delineators in the business. More and more properties are becoming more sophisticated with automation. I've talked about gate controls. What gate controls are is a keypad access where you're given a code, and if you are paid up on your rent, you put your code in, the gate allows you in. Sometimes properties have added individual alarms onto doors. That is becoming less and less popular. It's a little hard. There's a lot of glitches in those things, a lot of hard to control. For example, if you have 2 units and you're not linked up in the system, and you go to your second unit, an alarm may go off. Or somebody may run the gate. Somebody opens the gate, it's open, you don't put your code in, you go to your unit, you haven't put in your code to take the alarm out of the system, open up your storage unit, and an alarm goes off. So the alarms have something that was very favored in the 90s. It's becoming less and less favored as technology is able to control people coming and going onto the property, as well as the time basis in which they're able to come and go. It also allows you to delineate for customers. For example, you can create a certain level in your property to allow certain customers to come 24 hours a day by making a simple change in your computerization. If somebody pays an up fee for longer access hours, they can get longer access hours. In terms of management, I showed you the robotic aspects of storage that are coming along. That is becoming more and more popular, to have unmanned storage facilities, and the management of these things is becoming operated with the robots in one case. In many cases, there are kiosks where you can either talk to somebody directly, or it's completely run by a computer program. And more, as I've mentioned, the pricing for these things are controlled through third-party management systems and are displayed on websites online. And you can go online, you can actually write a lease for a storage unit, rent your storage unit, get a copy of the lease emailed to you and given your code, and you don't even have to show up at the property. The only time you show up at the property is when you want to go and move your things in. And then lastly, as an investment aspect, is the most important thing of self-storage is the differentiation between self-storage and other commercial real estate assets. So self-storage is identified and delineated away from apartments, retail, offices. It has extremely low turnover costs and releasing costs. That's one of the most attractive aspects of self-storage, particularly in today's era with COVID and offices and many people trying to figure out what is the future of office, how to reuse office space, how to change office space. That's going to be an expensive and bumpy turnover for people into that asset space. In storage, it's a pretty simplistic model. There's almost no cost other than cleaning out your unit and turning it over and releasing it very simply. There's also low CapEx in storage. That's changing with the sophistication of the properties. The higher level properties do require more CapEx, but if you're in one of these row garage, older type properties, you're really going 10 years until you have to replace a roof or more, or 10 years and you have to do much with your asphalt. If you're lucky and you do well in managing and watching over, your customers don't abuse your doors, you really don't have to do much with door maintenance or repairing walls or such. So there's actually very low CapEx. Probably the most significant and overlooked aspect of self-storage is the low obsolescence rate of self-storage. There is a very, very low obsolescence rate, and thus properties that were even first generation self-storage properties are still in the mix and still being leased and still being used. Now that presents a challenge in the coming years as unlike other assets, particularly office, apartments, retail, sometimes those properties just need to be removed from the inventory and demolished and taken down. It's very, very rare that a self-storage property is demolished. There are some cases in which storage properties are removed and taken away for other purposes, but the obsolescence of the use of the asset is actually so low that what you end up finding is they just slip down into a different category and a different pricing level. They become the discount storage property in the marketplace. So as more and more storage is added, it's generally added onto. It's not replacing old stock the way newer apartments or replacement office facilities or different types of retail will replace old retail. But as we will see in coming slides here, another aspect of storage is the low failure rate. Storage has had periods of bumpiness, and we're going to go through some of those areas and times, but generally there's a low failure rate. There are some people that lose their storage, have in different areas lost their storage properties because they haven't been able to lease up and they haven't been able to, on a cash flowing basis, keep them. But while they fail for an individual investor, they don't fail as a property. They end up being turned over. Maybe they're sold at a lower discount rate on a foreclosure basis, but somebody takes them back, puts them back into the marketplace and has a better capital structure and able to maintain still using that property for its intended use. So self-storage is investment, use, and demand. We've talked a little bit about this. There have been basic studies to show the type of general use and demand that you see in self-storage: 68% generally residential, 20% commercial, 6% military, 6% student use. And you can see by this graph, there are different reasons that people have stored, and you can kind of go through this list and, natural disaster, temporarily moving from residence. There's a lot of different things. But when you look at the bottom of this list, let's see here, you can see the bottom of this list is need temporary storage while moving and don't have room at your residence for things. So the nirvana of storage and its customer base is really having commercial users. Commercial users stay longer. They're generally less concerned about rent increases, and they're a very stable use to have as your part of your tenant mix. But even though the commercial users are desirable, residential users, that is the bread and butter of this business. So you can't take it for granted, and you can't assume that you're going to even build something or build a better mousetrap that's going to attract only commercial users. It's always going to be heavily skewed to the residential user. So use and demand in storage, it's known as the 3 Ds of self-storage. This is really the critical aspect in terms of who uses and what's going on. And the 3 Ds are death, divorce, and dislocation. But with COVID, we've come into really a couple of more Ds that we've found, which is disease and downsizing. So there's some more Ds that have been added to storage, but these are the primary drivers of why people go and use self-storage. And this is what the investment demand is about. Last thing is as an investment. And this I'm going to refer back to something we talked about earlier, which is the mystery of Bitcoin and non-fungible tokens. It's a bit of a mystery. And this in self-storage is the one mystery that we have yet to overcome in this industry, which is utilization and determining saturation. And there is just no definitive answer on this. So what does it take in terms of how long will it take to lease up this five-story, multi-story climate control place in some urban area? It is always a guess, and this is always the mystery of storage, and this is the risk of storage. So in past eras, lease up of a new storage project, you can see briefly here, between 6 and 12 months back in the 70s and 80s. That's what people were experiencing when they were building these things in the early days when they didn't exist and it was a new use. When we get in the 80s and the 90s, that's when I started in this career, 18 to 24 months was touted as being your basic lease up time frame once you built one of these things. And as you moved on, 90s really into the 2000s, the lease up time period for a new project is really now somewhere between 24 and 48 months. Everybody likes to stick at a 36-month time period as being your average lease up period for an average size new storage facility. But you cannot assume that in market phases such as today, for example. I know some people who have built some properties over the last year and a half, and because of COVID, they leased that thing up in half the time of normal. 18 months they leased it up. But in other time periods when things struggled, it may take as long as 48 months. And that is the toughest guess of an investment in terms of developing new, is determining your lease up. The other aspect is utilization. Again, the biggest question mark that goes on in this business. Back in the 70s and 80s, when I first got into the storage business, I remember the first time I went to a storage convention and I met with people who were mostly in blue jeans back then because they were contractors who had some excess land and they were building these fairly tinker toy type buildings. And they were talking about how fast they could break even to get to their break even point and being able to pay their bank debt. And back in those days, I remember having discussions with people that they said, if you got beyond 2.5 square feet on an average, across markets, average, if you were beyond 2.5 square feet in an average market, and in my case, I've always been Midwest based, so in the Midwest, then you were done. You were saturated. You were never going to get more than 2.5 square feet. You might as well move on to another market area. But back in the 70s and 80s, even in California, there were certain market areas that were clocking up to 8 square feet per person. Even back in the 1980s, San Bernardino, California had an operator known as Daryl's Mini Storage. And at the time back then in the late 80s, they astounded everybody with having about 8 square feet per person in the marketplace of developed square footage that was occupied by at least at 85% level. And it far outstripped everybody in the marketplace. Whereas other marketplaces were barely struggling with 2 square feet per person and they couldn't reach an 85% level. So this is always a bit of a mystery, and it's very, very localized, and it takes time to really understand this aspect of the business. As time went on in the 80s and 90s, you can see the average rates then were popping up. There was more square footage and there was more utilization. So you had 4 to 10 square feet per person in marketplaces in the 80s and 90s. Now in the 2000s, averages. Now these are just averages. You're finding averages of anywhere from 7 to around 15 square feet per person in a marketplace. Again, identified as being healthy as those 7 to 15 square feet per person of total square footage in the marketplace has an average of about 85% occupancy. That would be considered a not saturated, but in a level demand basis. But that is the biggest question mark in this business that is like a question mark of Bitcoin. More about this in a few minutes. So now I'm going to go on to the US and show you a little bit about where we are in the US with this marketplace. So market size, the total number of facilities in the United States. There is not a consensus on this. It's somewhere between 49,000 and 60,000 storage facilities around the United States. The reason for the discrepancy is there's many older facilities. I keep mentioning this about older facilities that are still in service, many rural facilities. They don't belong to an association. They're not reporting numbers anywhere. They're just sort of out there, small, not well documented, but they are facilities and they are self-storage and they exist. So it's a little bit unclear about the total number of facilities. And this calculates to about 1.9 billion square feet of self-storage in the US market today. Utilization rates. This is not the same utilization rate that I'm referring to. It's just purely the number of people using self-storage. So there's 13.5 million households that are using self-storage. That equates to approximately 11% of the population on any given day is renting a self-storage unit. And on an average basis, that clocks out to about 5.9 square feet per person. Now that's a very average number. Again, as I just mentioned, the utilization rates, as you'll see in a minute in some other slides, in some areas are well into the teens. So in the much more urbanized area and the more popular Sunbelt areas, this number is way, way higher. When you go into either some rural areas or some very, very dense urban markets, the square feet per person drops dramatically. New York, for example, has one of the lower square foot per person rates because there's only so much self-storage that can be built in New York City. There's only so many properties someone can find to develop, and they have millions of people in the metropolitan area. So therefore, the square feet per person is a very low number in New York. The finances of self-storage. So annual revenues of self-storage, really 39.5, but I put $40 billion is the avenue revenues being generated by self-storage across the United States. When you apply average operating factors, so average operating expense for a self-storage facility is 38.5% of revenues are spent for expenses. When you imply a cap rate, and this is really using some REIT, real estate investment trust information for 2021, it implies a derived property value of self-storage in the United States of almost $550 billion of value of buildings that are out there in the United States. And ownership. This is probably the most important aspect of what's going on in the US market today. So the ownership is divided in three categories. Public companies, these are the top 5 REITs. There's actually a sixth REIT, another company that's trying to go public right now as well. They're very, very small in market cap, so we don't really mention them. But there are 5 major real estate investment trust companies, plus U-Haul. U-Haul is always included because U-Haul, while it is actually a public company and is primarily in the business of what everyone knows it for trucks and equipment, it is as significant as a REIT and tends to operate a little bit more like a REIT, even though it's a public company. So whenever you see reporting of this in terms of public companies, U-Haul is always included in those numbers. Technically, U-Haul isn't a public company, but it's always included. Anyway, over the years, the public companies and U-Haul have aggregated and acquired numbers of assets to be approximately a third, or 31.2% of ownership of all storages in this country. The top 100 operators. This includes the largest operators, people who could own anywhere from 50 even to 100, 150 properties. It also includes one of the largest drivers of what's happening in the industry right now are those with private equity funds who have been buying up storages all over the country, particularly in a feverish bent in the last 5, 6, 7 years. That's about 16.5%. And then is the small operators. Small operators, also referred generically as mom and pop operators in the self-storage business. These people are identified by owning from 1 to 3 properties. And the mom and pops are at 52.3%. Now, they are still the majority owners of self-storage here in this country, which shows that the consolidation and the opportunities in the business are still there. But interestingly, while I don't have the statistic here to show you, I have seen this. As little as 5 years ago, the small operator percentage ownership was closer to 72%. And the number of between the public companies and the top operators has grown and aggregated, and they are consolidating more and more in the industry as time has gone on. But there's still room in the business to be a small operator, and there's still opportunity. So just to give you an idea of how big the self-storage market really is, this slide really gives you a good idea. So if you combined all of the outlets of Subway, which people have recognized Subway's even larger than McDonald's in terms of number of units, Dollar General and CVS together, the aggregation of those, there's still more self-storage facilities out there than the total of a combination of Subway, Dollar, and CVS. So start to think about that when you think that, oh, this is some side commercial property type, different than things that people think, well, it's always just sort of an anomaly. It's just a secondary thing. That's how big the self-storage business is. And this slide is a good indicator of that. So I mentioned to you that it was going to give a little bit more in terms of the market size. So these two lists show you the top markets by existing rentable square feet of inventory in 2020, by the end of 2021. And interestingly, you'll see a few things in here, starting on the top of the list, which is both Dallas and Houston leading the top of the list with the largest amount of self-storage. It makes sense when you think about my definition of how storage works and mobility, that there are more people moving to Texas than almost anywhere else these days. And as people are moving in, they need places to put their things. You can also see in this list on the left-hand side, it's interesting, it shows the square foot per capita. This is the square foot per person rate, as I referred to, the utilization rate. So you can see both in Dallas and Houston, they're both clocking at over 10 square feet per person of utilization of self-storage. And then you can see the differences as you're moving down. There's New York and New Jersey right there. You see what that drops down to is 3.5 square feet, which that includes New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So you can imagine how little there is in New York and in some of the more urban areas versus what the potential demand could be. Moving over on the right-hand side, you see the top 10 markets by rentable inventory, by rentable square foot inventory per capita. So this shows where the highest amount of square footage exists per capita in these specific markets. To be blunt, I have no idea where that town is in Utah and why they have so many square feet of self-storage, but there's some place that is operating with almost 30 square feet per person up there in Utah. You can see in Greenwood, South Carolina has built a lot. You can see particular submarkets there, North Carolina and Texas, and California starts to clock in. Florida is not surprising, it clocks in. But when you can see the highest numbers, as I mentioned earlier in my statistics, that in today's world, an average number between 7 and upwards of about 15 square feet per person, these are all clocking either above or at that highest number. So again, I reference that that's one of the biggest mysteries in storage. What's a saturation rate, saturation point for self-storage in any particular submarket? What is the appropriate measure when looking at a submarket? And that is a very tough and risky position for any investor looking in this business to figure out. Moving on, this is self-storage under construction that's going on, and you can see, not surprisingly, some of the most populated areas are also the areas with the highest amount of construction. You see the New York, New Jersey area, and then of course Dallas, Fort Worth. Interesting, Philadelphia being a bit of an older community, has a lot of construction going on. Phoenix, of course, I think interestingly, people don't realize that Phoenix is our, I believe, 5th largest city in the United States now. Atlanta, Miami, Washington, Houston, LA, all the areas where there's high inflow of people. So average properties now. So I've shown you the marketplace in the US and what goes on. This is now on an average property basis. So the average self-storage property size is just a little under 57,000 square feet. When I started in the industry back in the 80s, it was closer to about 25 or 30,000 square feet. So you can see a big difference. Average occupancy today, 92%. We can all knock wood. Everybody in the industry has been very thankful for COVID. We'll discuss that a little bit later. But COVID has been very, very good to the storage business. Average storage unit price, $88.95 a month. I can't really comment on that because rates vary very tremendously in submarkets. Very difficult to take that average price and really apply that to much of anything. Average rental duration of 14 months. That is something that is much longer and is, again, an outgrowth of the COVID era, where people have stayed in these units much longer. Back in the day, I remember the average numbers in the earlier part of the 2000s, more like 9 months to 10 months. We've moved up to 14 months being an average. User demographics. I will be blunt on this. Some of this stuff baffles me because when you take all these percentages across the age brackets, it's certainly more than 100% in terms of use. But you can see that basically what you have is a 40 55-year-old, the 55-year-old segment is your largest user of self-storage. It's interesting that even though people think of storage as being a thing used by people moving from place to place, I mentioned earlier in this presentation that the highest utilization rate of storage is for single-family homeowners. And so at first you would think, well, if storage is for people who are moving new, you would think younger people, but more often younger people are moving to smaller places, apartments, and quite frankly, they haven't accumulated the amount of stuff that they're wanting to keep. And so it's logical to actually skew to a higher age range of people using self-storage. And even when you look at the farther end of that graph, ages 56 to 74 and 75 plus, obviously people who are older, maybe family members have moved things in. Again, I point to the 3Ds of storage, the death component, people putting things away when they're either away, near death. That's the reason for the skewing of the older age. There's not necessarily those people 75 plus who are coming in and picking up heavy things and moving them back and forth from storage. Probably more important in these user demographics is the skew that's always there of female to male. There are more women that rent self-storage than men. And that has actually always been the case. People just think of men as moving into self-storage. And while predominantly men do the physical lifting, that is true, it is much more predominant. It has always been more predominant. Women are making the buying choices and the buying decisions for self-storage. It was one of the largest reasons why in the 1990s, we'll get into the eras in a minute, why people started focusing on aesthetics of the self-storage business and trying to make their properties look more retail oriented and have higher aesthetics, frankly, to appeal to the women that were coming and looking at these things. Forgive me, I don't mean it to be a sexist remark. It just became an issue in the industry that the aesthetics of the property and drawing people in became an important driver of how to aggregate customers. And of course, items stored. This is your split of items stored, furniture being the largest thing, clothing, home appliances, sporting goods. You can see the business items reinforcing that while you'd like to have commercial customers, business items is still only about a 6% number of the items stored in self-storage facilities. And lastly, I think this is the last one, on an average property snapshot, and this is probably for anyone interested in investing. This REIT operating profile is pretty close to what you'll find. I'm not a REIT. I've operated as a private, smaller operator, but these really track fairly closely to what you'll find in terms of your operating expenses on an individual property basis. By far, your two biggest expenses are going to be your property taxes and what's called property management. Property management includes a little bit more than just paying your on-site employees. The property management will include G&A. One of the things in here that's not shown that's become a bigger driver is your technology costs for accepting credit cards and the payment of credit card processing, costs for being online and all of those things. And that'll get included in your property management as well. But you can see the rest of these. Repair and maintenance, 10%. That number will vary quite a bit depending on the sophistication level of your property. If you have a multi-story property, you're going to have much higher repair and maintenance costs actually than a property. Even if you're in a Midwest climate where you have to remove snow, you will have a higher repair and maintenance category because you have many more systems that you're going to have to operate. You're going to have elevator maintenance. You're going to have a lot more costs. Climate control, just paying for the HVAC, maintaining it and operating it is just an aspect that drives up some of those costs. It doesn't eclipse your property taxes or your property management costs, but it will skew higher generally. But again, these are average numbers that are being shown. Your average profit margins, I would say that on a REIT basis, this seems about correct. On a private operating basis, your operating expenses do tend to go a little bit more than 25%. Again, this is an average, so it will include a lot of lower end properties that have less expenses in operating. But generally, this is directionally correct. more private storage operators will say your NOI is closer to about 65%. The difference being put onto the expenses. So expenses being more about 30%, plus you got your CapEx in there at 5%, could be more like 7%. So that's more of your private operation, how you're going to find these things are skewed. I'm not going to get into what the G&A of percentage of assets are. That has more to do with what the REITs are charging for operating. No, moving on. I'm going to go back to some history here. And this is a history of the industry in the US through different time eras. Partly this is being done so I can do this, and I can also show you some of my own personal history and how I sort of trailed with the history and how the growth of this is going on in the US. So first I started in the 1960s. Again, storage is about 50 years old and really started in the 1960s. And here I say public storage sets the trend, and you'll understand that in a moment. So in 1958 in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, was the first identification of an individual storage units in a single building. That was the first place where self-storage was identified. In 1964, the first self-storage facilities were actually found in Odessa, Texas. Interestingly, they were branded as A1, you store, you lock, and you carry the key. That was the name of the storage facility. I find that interesting because those are the critical aspects that I mentioned earlier about the legal position of self-storage, that you're using it, you're locking it, you're keeping the key. Those were the identifying features of what is a self-storage versus a regular industrial building. And that's what they called them back then, 1964. The ones in Odessa, Texas, they were the first ones to use individual garage doors and individual units, first ones ever. However, the ones in Odessa, Texas, they were marketed and used mostly for people who were in the oil business. People who were going down and doing wildcatting and drilling and things like that, and mostly marketed as a business use rather than an individual use. But in the mid-1960s in Houston, Texas, the first facilities with individual doors marketed for personal and residential use started to appear. So that's where self-storage was first sort of invented. Then you can see I've got a picture. I don't know if this was the actual first self-storage. It is called First Street Storage Garages, you can see. But this was definitely one of the earlier versions of self-storage. My guess is this has been retrofitted. You can see new concrete driveways, and it looks like doors have been upgraded on this building. But you can see it was an older construction building that's had some rehab to it. And this may very well be one of the very first generation self-storages down in Texas. Then we move on. Here's an older version of an early self-storage. This was also in Texas. You can see this was hand built. This was something you can see with the wood construction inside. Now, in today's world, nobody would build with wood inside, not because it's a fire hazard, but because it attracts and sucks up moisture and then creates a situation where you can have mold and mildew inside. But you can see this has been upgraded too. You can see there's been probably new concrete that's put in. They've added some lights outside. The doors are relatively new, but you can see there were large doorway openings that were created, and they put newer doorways to enhance this property. But you can see what the early iterations of these things looked like. Then came along Ken Volk and B. Wayne Hughes. These guys were the two guys who were the founders of PSI, which is their stock ticker, which is Public Storage. Public Storage is by far the largest company in America in the self-storage. They far eclipse everybody else. They started in the early 1970s. And here is actually a picture of a party at their very first storage facility in El Cajon, California. This was that first guy you saw, I believe, is the guy in the hat who's walking out with the plate of food there. I believe that was one of the founders there. And this was a little garden party they had up the very first self-storage property opened by Public Storage in 1972. And there it is roughly today. This is a little bit older picture, but this property still exists and still is in use by Public Storage. So again, it goes to reinforce that there's not a lot of obsolescence in this business. But in the 1970s, particularly anyone who was familiar with California in the 1970s, it became a very regular sight to start seeing the orange doors and the orange signs of Public Storage all over the place in California. They jumped out well ahead of everybody in the industry and really became the industry norm and leader and set many of the paths that people follow even today in the self-storage industry. So Back then, there was issues confronting the industry and limiting growth. First thing was unknown demand levels. That goes back to the saturation and utilization figure that I keep talking about and saying it's still unknown today, but it was completely unknown back in the 1960s and 1970s. Nobody had any idea how much people wanted or needed self-storage. The only way people were investing, I refer to as blind investing. Public storage had set up limited partnerships, had people investing in limited partnerships. And as they grew very quickly, they became a trusted name. So they were able to generate deals and money into their business by virtue of their track record and what they were doing. Other people who were getting into the business, they touted the investment and they used a different story. This was a story in the 1970s in order to bring this investment out of California and into other areas by calling it a land holding device. The idea was saying that the buildings were fairly simple and cheap to erect and put on a property. You could put it on a large property and you could hold that property by creating a cash flowing use, self-storage, and utilizing that property for future additional industrial development or other uses in the future. Now, the truth was, again, I referenced the lack of obsolescence of self-storage. There have actually been very few self-storages that have been taken down. I'll show you an example where I've done one, but very few of those where they've taken down and repurposed the property for something else. But really, it was an investment story that was used in order to get people to invest because they couldn't point to any numbers in that era to determine how does this make sense? How many people are going to come in? How fast are they going to come in? Why is this needed? It was really just a big mystery, but it just kept going and going. And then this was the other side of the coin. The key facet pushing the growth of self-storage was this land holding device story, as well as the pre-engineered building. That was the critical aspect of why people took this on from California, from Texas, and said, let's try it in other places. Not because they could really identify the numbers and justify it from market to market back in the day, but because it was relatively simple. It was an erector set. You could buy a packaged unit from one of many suppliers that were starting to grow in the 70s and the 80s. And within a couple of months, they could place these storage buildings down, lock, stock, and barrel, boom, down on a slab piece of concrete that you pour, and boom, you were in the storage business. It was such a simple model that it really was facilitating the growth because of the simplicity. What people needed was the story, the investment story, which was difficult to prove because it wasn't as prevalent as it is today. So moving on in the 1980s, we got to the era, as I call it, Reagan, Tom Cruise, and greed is good until it wasn't. You'll understand in a minute. So we're going way back to the 1980s for those that can remember those days, and those who can remember Ronald Reagan and Ronald Reagan's revolution, his tax revolution. This revolution was the reason for the hyper growth of the self-storage business. I'm going to run you through briefly if you don't have a remembrance of the 1980s. So in the middle of the beginning of the 1980s, we had the Tax Recovery Act of 1981. This was, for those that are not aware, was absolutely landmark legislation promoted by Ronald Reagan that brought down personal income rates. The highest rate was brought down by 23%. It permitted passive income losses to be fully deductible. It gave us accelerated depreciation for commercial properties. And then in 1982, we had the linchpin of the rest of this, which was the Garn-St. Germain Act. Most people are familiar with the idea of savings and loans, or when you hear savings and loans, you cringe and think about savings and loans had some kind of problem with commercial real estate. In short, what this act allowed was savings and loans were allowed to invest in commercial real estate. Previously, they were really set up for home lending only. But in order to save the banking business, they deregulated this. They allowed them to invest in commercial real estate, and everybody was kind of off to the races. And what did that mean? Well, it gave rise to real estate syndications. So storage as a pre-engineered, fast to deploy, easy project became a real preference of syndicators. People put together limited partnerships very quickly. They raised money. And really the story of the day back in the early 1980s wasn't so much what you were building. It was just the fact that you were building something. real estate became such a great way to shield income from income taxes back in the 1980s that everybody and their brother was in some kind of real estate syndication deal. And self-storage was the absolute darling of it because you could get this thing up and going very, very quickly. There was very little involved to get involved. So there was a huge number of self-storage properties that were built mostly because of the tax losses that people were getting. That's why it was driven. There wasn't a demand component that people were looking at back in the 1980s, but it had much more to do with a tax structure. It was estimated by the SSSA, that was the precursor of the main association in the self-storage business, which is called the Self-Storage Association. It used to be called the Self-Service Storage Association. And Minico, which is a major publisher and provider of insurance in the industry, they estimated there were approximately 30,000 properties. So a big bulk of what exists in the business, because as I said today, we're somewhere between 49 and 60,000 properties today. So a big bulk of the properties were built by the time you got to the end of the 1980s. So what did it mean? Tom Cruise, as I said, everyone, I feel the need for speed. Everybody who was in the business and understood what the tax implications were ran as fast as they could to get it going. That's why storage was so popular in the 80s. Not because all of a sudden everyone said I needed more storage space. It was much more driven by the tax implications, and we caught up beyond that. Well, we caught up really, really well, and we actually hit the brakes. For those that remember, things were really good for a really short time. By 1986, the government realized Reagan's tax revolution was too good, and they had to put some brakes on this thing because they weren't collecting much revenue in the federal government, and realized that they needed to put a stop to some of these things. So in 1986, they had revisions to this tax law. They reversed the tax shelter status of the passive lost income. They reversed the accelerated depreciation schedules, not completely, but in some cases, and it exposed the S&L frauds. Now, the frauds had more to do with people recognizing that S&Ls had a bucket of money in them, and they could get a hold of that money and they could start directing around funds, and people who did illegal, fraudulent things had nothing to do with self-storage or even the properties that were built. It was really just fraudulent operators that were getting a hold of the cash that was in S&Ls and started kicking out a lot of money and fees and doing, let's just say, nefarious real estate activities through S&Ls. People went to jail. It was a big scandal by the late 1980s. And by the end of 1980s, George Bush was elected. And one of the very first acts that George Bush put forward was creating the Resolution and Trust Corporation. It's also known as the RTC, for those that remember it. The RTC was an entity that was set up in the Bush era, very, very first couple of months when he was president, and it was designed to set up as a quasi-government, quasi-private organization to liquidate the failed holdings of failed S&Ls. The S&Ls were failing; they had assets that were owned, and they had to put them back in the market somehow. I don't want to debate whether this was good or bad. There's many things that have been written about it. It was a very efficient, fast process to kick the assets out of S&Ls and get them back into responsible operators' hands. And basically, they held auctions and people bought them for cents on the dollar. And they bought all kinds of things: office buildings, apartment buildings, and of course, self-storages. Back in that era, though, self-storage wasn't its own classification. It was identified as more of a warehouse property, a little bit hidden in S&Ls. I had some background together with my father in being involved in that in the 1990s. We bid on many of these things in the 1990s. It was an interesting time, but it didn't do a whole lot of favors for the growth of self-storage because it had been overgrown to some degree. So we're getting into the 1990s, that era. As I said, storage cleans up, grows up, and moves in. I'll define that for everybody. So from about 1989, when the RTC was set up, and it ended in 1995, so that was a very quick program. They really cleaned it up. But during that time period, real estate lending had dried up to almost nothing because there was a collapse of commercial properties. There were rule changes that were being pushed through for primarily commercial properties and how you had to make accounting designations, as well as the S&L crisis. it created a collapse of commercial real estate in the late 80s, early 90s. During that time, hundreds, thousands of properties were sold through the RTC below replacement cost. I'll get into that a little bit later with self-storage, but the RTC had sold these properties out very, very quickly. But what happened was the demand for real estate had crashed because developing anything new was next to impossible. And then there were changes that were ushered in 1989. FIREA changed the way you made appraisals. For those of a certain age that remember that time period, when you used to get an appraisal, there was a joke in the 1980s that when you got an MAI appraisal, made as instructed, that's what we referred to it as. That you would call up your appraiser and say, I need an appraisal to say this, and I don't care what you say, I don't care how you say it, it's got to say this number, it's got to say I've got this valuation. And for a period of time in the 1980s, until they regulated this industry a little bit more, it was a little bit made as instructed. And now it's become a more legitimate industry that can't just do as instructed by developers. So from 93 to 96, the industry grew up. So there was a slow growth due to a lack of knowledge and sophistication in the self-storage business. There was a lack of capital for development, certainly in the 1990s. In the early 90s, there were low occupancies in a lot of properties. Again, a lot of these properties were being resold, but they were just, in a sense, just overbuilt. There were way too many storage properties put in and operating than could be absorbed during the time frame in which they were put in. That was really the bigger problem. But it gave an appearance in the industry that there was a lower demand because there was just a bit of a slower absorption period of these properties. So there were unreliable statistics on customer utilization and lease up. And again, they put these things in place. Early properties, if you recall from earlier discussion, in the 70s, properties were leasing up in 12 months. Well, sometimes they were putting these properties down and they weren't leased up in 2 years. That wasn't necessarily a problem in the marketplace per se. It was just catching up. It was just an absorption issue. So the result of this was the industry was starting to look to gathering data. Developers had to pivot and they had to start looking at penetrating new markets. That was the only way that they could start building because the old reliable industrial, back alley industrial type properties have been overbuilt. And so developers were looking to penetrate new markets. And we saw a rise of securitization, or really the coming of REITs. Because of the lack of capital, there were people that had enough significant assets that they were able to turn to the public market, public stock market, and turn themselves into REITs. And that's where the REITs started forming in this country. So in the later part of the 1990s, I say they move in. How did they move in? They moved inward into non-penetrated areas. So the only way for developers really to get lending and to lure lending in is they were looking for less penetrated markets. The properties that have been developed in the 70s and the 80s have been done in the easy to pick off, cherry picking locations in the suburban areas, in industrial parks that were underdeveloped, rural areas, places where you barely needed any approvals. Going in and getting real kind of approvals and things that people are probably more familiar with today really was something relatively new for self-storage in the 1990s. But developers were doing it because there was no penetration, there was no competition. So that was the idea. There was a mantra back in the day about retail type locations. That became the big mantra of calling it retail type locations. And seeking locations that had high visibility, high traffic. There was the appearance of urban multi-story projects started coming along in the late 1990s. Again, these were less penetrated areas and there was a high population base. It made logical sense to say there is a marketplace. We don't know how big the marketplace is. We just know there's a lot of people and we'll put this product here and this will work where there's a lot of people and a lot less choice for where they will go and store. And so what did this do? By getting these retail type locations and multi-story type projects and improved development quality, big reason to do that was because local zoning required it. That was, developers always wanted to develop for the cheapest nickel possible. But some developers looked and said, I'm going to go into these areas that haven't been penetrated. Well, in order to do that, you had to increase your quality in order to get the zoning. You had vertical development. Vertical development wasn't just to go up because we wanted to go up. We went up because it helped spread the costs. It also increased your pro forma lease-up time. If you increase the size of the property, you could justify in saying, okay, it's going to take me more than 2 years to lease up. I mean, we in a area, which I'll show you soon, in a project that I had done where there was a huge amount of population and literally no self-storage nearby, we had forecasted the bank it was going to take us 3 years to lease up. Didn't take anywhere near that, but that was the guess that we had at the time. But by having these larger projects, spreading the costs, you could justify your pro formas. And then really by the late 1990s, you started to see the true emergence of class A, B, and C of self-storage. There was no discussion of that type of class delineation in the 1980s. By the time in the end of the 1990s, working with appraisers, working with bank resources, it really started becoming more delineated like other commercial property types have class A, B, and C. So then we get in the era of 2000, 2008. That's the area. So I say storage was back on firm footings and there was a new level of sophistication. So we went from this in the 1970s and we were now getting this. So we've come a long way, baby, in those eras. And that was a big change of what was going on. And this became much more the norm when we get into the 2000s. So what do we see here? So I've got some graphs and a lot more graphs and tables coming up here. You can see, if you can read these numbers, this shows the amount of development of facilities. And I circled this one area. You can see by the late 1990s, you can see the graph is sort of flatlined up there, where there was a fairly stable amount of development that started going on in the 1990s. You can see the ramp up from the early 90s when things were not good. And it ramps up. I don't know if you can see my cursor in this. It ramps up to about 1996 through 2000. It was fairly level, and that was an industry and identification. The industry was stabilizing, but then we reach into the 2000s, and you can see where that graph starts to really rise up in a steep way. There was a lot more development across the country, and average utilization was really popping from the story I told you when I first went to my first storage convention in the late 1980s, where it was 2.5 square feet per person on average. We were clocking more about 6 or 7 square feet per person on an average market basis, that you could say that's how many people were occupying and using self-storage. And it gave rise and number credibility for the developers to go in and develop in these marketplaces. Oops. Forgive me, I went too far. Let's see if I can go back. It's not letting me go back. Let's see if I can do this. Nope. Doesn't want to. Okay, so we get to 2008. And as I say, 2008 is everybody's least favorite number. That was one of my not so favorite numbers. Great Recession. And we can all remember this, September of 2008, Lehman goes out and it starts one of the roughest times that anyone else has ever seen. And so this was chronicled here in the Wall Street Journal. This is in May 2008. And it says, self-storage business faces a test. Wall Street watching if the REIT performance holds up. The REITs were performing quite well in the early 2000s. They were starting to show that this was a real asset class and a real business to be paying attention to. And they weren't sure going into 2008 and what was happening. And I note the date, March 14th, 2008. Things were getting rocky in 2008, if we all remember back then, but we didn't have the real financial upheaval until September of that year. So they were then asking the questions in 2008, is self-storage recession-proof? Because storage was still operating quite well. While there was a pipeline of business that started falling off in 2008, the business was still performing well. And so by the time we get to the next year, this is the industry, the state of self-storage industry in 2009, they were discovering what became the truth of this industry and from the Great Recession. It wasn't recession-proof. There was hurt in the business, but it was, at the very least, it was recession-resistant. That storage performed pretty well, certainly as compared to other industry segments, which we'll see in a minute. And that's what we get to. This is a table that shows across the top office, industrial, retail, residential, healthcare, lodging and resort self-storage. These are all REITs, all the performance of the REITs. The only property sector to really perform well in 2008, as you scan across and look at all those negative numbers, and then come to your lowly self-storage, your row garage thing that everybody laughed at. The only one that produced positive returns in 2008 was self-storage. And you can see, while self-storage had some ups and downs, it stayed positive all the way through. If you scan down that list, this goes from 2008 to 2015. So you can see the Great Recession. While there was some pain in the business, I don't mean to say that there wasn't. This was another area of difficulty in 2008, 2009, 2010, but it was resistant somewhat to the recession. It didn't fall off the cliff the way you see the other sectors. So now, in the era of 2010 to COVID, new growth, as I say, private equities take a seat at the table. I have a lot of graphs coming up, and this also shows the sophistication level of this industry. As you may note, I've shown a lot of pictures of a lot of storage facilities. Now I'm showing a lot more graphs and a lot more numbers because this industry has become more sophisticated and there's a lot more data to support what's going on in this business. Most notably was something like this, where you can see in this graph, and this is graphing from 1994 to 2014. And you can see, again, this is a comparison of REIT sectors, that self-storage was performing the highest of all the REIT sectors, both in return on investment as well as less standard deviation. So it means it was more secure that this thing was really returning the returns that they were saying. And there wasn't a deviation between companies. This was really, truly was making these returns that was being touted, even though a lot of people thought storage was kind of a secondary class of commercial asset. Moving on, there's a lot of information on this. This is historical cap rates, as well as growth of the business. In this graph, it's showing 4 or 5 different things at the same time. It's running from 1995 into the mid 2010s, into 2016. You can see by the darkest blue bars, you can see the physical occupancy. It was staying up fairly strong in these properties. The green line is more of an investment category line. It's the cap rates. Cap rates in storage were inextricably, although a hangover from the early 1990s, those cap rates were hanging up at about 10% rate for the longest time. And as storage was continually performing well, that cap rate started coming down in the early 2000s. That was corresponding with at the same time, the other blue line with the dots going up. That's the rentable square feet per person. So the cap rates were actually falling while the amount of square footage was actually increasing, because the recognition of this asset class was really starting to be seen in the marketplace until we hit the crisis time, 2007, 2008. You can see the cap rates blipping up in 2008, 2009 because of the difficulty of the business, but not that high. You can see that the cap rates, while there was a blip going up in the cap rates, it didn't jump up all that high. And you can see also that the physical occupancies, there was a dip, but it wasn't a tremendous dip that went down. So it was remaining fairly steady, but you can see the one steadiest line growing up was the amount of rentable square feet per person. Moving on, you can then see as you go in, as we got past the recession period, 2013, 14, 15, you could start to see the ramping up of construction activity. And this was the amount being spent in millions of dollars in each of those years, going all the way up into last year, or 2020. And you can see in this graph, this is supply and demand. So this is a very clear graph that shows what happened with the collapse of the economy from 08. You can see the spiking of vacancy going on, relatively speaking, in storage. And you can also see the amount of properties that were coming into the market new. And you can see that really dipping down starting in 08, 9, 10, 11, 12 was anemic. But you can then see the precipitous fall of vacancy, which meant the occupancies were going up. And then you can see where we start hitting in, similar to that last graph that I showed you in 2013 to 2020, the amount of construction activity. You see the same kind of graphing going on here with the blue bars. And you can also see that the vacancy level, even though, look at the amount of activity and construction that was going on, but you see a fairly steady occupancy level. The utilization was growing. People were using, they were building storage, people were using storage. It was just getting better and better as things went on. And lastly here, one of the things that was starting to occur during this time leading up to COVID, and this is a segment that I grabbed of this particular area, you can see this is the NOI of the REITs. And there was a definitive downward pattern beginning in 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. The reason for their NOI reduction was the amount of growth that was going on. There was a huge amount of supply that was going on. And recall from earlier discussion that the way these things operate is in order to get people into these new properties, you have to discount in the beginning. So there's rent discounting. Well, that's going to affect your NOI growth. And if there was more properties being put in the marketplace, that meant more competition for these REITs, or the REITs were buying out properties that weren't fully occupied at this point, and they were having to put in rent strategies to discount rent and pull down the NOIs. And that's the function of the market. So instead of having a crash as we had at the end of the 1980s, or a crash that we had in 2008, when there was some difficulties in 2008, not as bad as the office sector or housing sector, certainly in 2008, this was the market reacting appropriately. So by the mid 2010s to late 2010s, we had a market that now was reacting appropriately as there was more product and it was lagging in its operational performance. People were starting to think by the late teens, 2018, 2019, there was a slowdown in looking at what was going to happen with storage and the growth of storage, because there was an expected time period of absorption. There wasn't a time period of property failure. It wasn't foreclosures. As we saw immediately past 2008, there was a period of foreclosures. We just saw a slowdown in the business, and the absorption was taking its place in the business, showing a slowdown in NOI and a corresponding slowdown in growth of construction. It said, remember the slide that I just passed, maybe I can go back. That slide I passed back there said that the peak of construction growth was in 2018. So as you'll see, actually, this is the one that says in 2018. So it's the perfect time on this slide. So this is a combination. This growth rate, this is showing a TTM, trailing 12 months. That's the way storage has been really valued by investors buying it, looking at the last 12 months of operating totals. And you can track what's going on this graph by the growth rate of properties, of the NOI of properties. And the blue on the bottom is the total spending of investment in storage. And you can see what had happened. You can watch the failure from the recessionary times and the lag time post-recession, 08, 09. What happened during these times, and I don't have a graph to support it here, but I will just say it in talking, is that the REITs started slipping in their performance. And I just showed you the NOI slowdown going on in the mid-teens. But there was a new investment class, which is private equity funds started coming in and started buying out those properties. If you recall earlier in the session, I showed the ownership division, where there's the REITs have about a third of the properties, and the private small property owner has about 50%. But as I had mentioned, only 7 years earlier, that number was about 72%, not 50%. Well, the big driver of the buyer of these things were these private equity funds. They saw what self-storage was about, and they started jumping into the market big, and they were not constrained by the performance that they were seeing in their NOI growth, because that restrains REITs in the public marketplace, but it doesn't restrain the private equities. So there was a new class of investor, which was a large investment fund, private equity fund, that could take a little bit longer term view and a little bit longer term flyer, if you will, on where they were investing in markets. They started investing in different marketplaces that were a little bit secondary or tertiary. They weren't fighting for the high-end LA, Miami Beach, New York properties. They were going into Detroit, they were going into Philadelphia, and they were going into secondary markets, even tertiary markets, and buying up all of these properties. And this somewhat, without saying it, shows what was happening in the marketplace. So there was a huge amount of spend going on and growing in the late teens. The trailing 12 months were starting to fall, as you can see, in the later teens, and that corresponds really with the results that the REITs were having falling in the later part of the teens until we got to COVID. So now I'm going to go through a little bit more history, but I call it his story, which is really a little bit of my history of development to tell everyone and show you what I've done and how I matched with some of these eras of growth and plateauing of the self-storage business. So my first entree into storage was in a place called Mundelein, Illinois. Mundelein, Illinois is a suburban community that is smack dab in the middle of Lake County, Illinois, which is the county just north of Cook County, where Chicago is located. So it's purely suburban Chicago. And in 1983, this wasn't me, myself, and I. My father had purchased a property and followed that notion of the landholding device, that story of the landholding. And if you can see this from the highlighting, that's the size property that my father and his investors had purchased, and he put a self-storage property on this property. Now, this was considered to be a growing suburban, but you can see just from the photo, this was truly a rural type market when he started. He built this self-storage property and used it as a landholding device until he was going to develop the property. The plan was to develop it for a large regional retail center. But he put the self-storage property down. He was the third guy in to propose doing a self-storage on this particular property. He finally got approval from the community after the third time of being asked. He built it, and indeed, when he built this thing, it filled up in about 12 months, and he expanded it by 2 buildings in the back very quickly because he did so well. That's where he became very enamored with the storage business and turned his passion over to me to try to get involved in this business. He was so enamored with how quickly it leased up and how well it did. So we had that property, was doing quite well. I graduated from college and joined him, and we started looking at the business and came on the notion of saying, you know what, we don't know a lot about the storage business. We knew it did really well out in our area, but all we knew is it just needed people. So we turned our sights into the city of Chicago. And we had owned an office building in the city of Chicago that wasn't doing particularly well, but we knew there were an awful lot of people in the city of Chicago, and there was just very few self-storage facilities. And we just didn't really know. We were just sort of guessing. Where do people need them? We figured, sort of middle of the road, middle income. We had a sense that people with single family homes from our suburban property were users of this, that we didn't necessarily need to be near apartment buildings and things like that, which was an old model. So we found a spot in this map you can see in the middle that was halfway between downtown Chicago, which is kind of on your bottom right and over to the right and to the bottom, and out to the suburbs, and the sort of the gateway to the suburbs in Chicago is O'Hare Airport, which is right there. And so we found a spot sort of halfway in between, and there was nobody existing with storage. So there it is. There's our spot. You can see the photo of the area. And the reason I show the photo is to show what we used to refer to as all the rooftops. This is all the single family homes, and some apartment buildings were out in the area. And we found an area where there was underutilized industrial buildings right there. And you can even see right across the street from where the little acorn is. And you'll see in a minute why I have that little acorn symbol. And it was right near a highway interchange, and it actually overlooked the freeway right to O'Hare Airport. We figured people needed to see us. We wanted to have like our own big billboard, and we wanted to be close in where all the people were. And so we were busy working on it, and this is what we developed, or this is what we conceived of, I should say, Acorn Self-Storage. That's the reason. There's a reason for Acorn, which I'll mention in a minute. This was the rendering of what we started with, and then here is what we actually built. So it looks pretty much like, almost exactly like the rendering. We put white siding on the thing. We had no windows, so nobody could really see what it was, which was a bit of an error back in the day. But in order to attract attention to it, we ran red neon around the top to gain attention. We used black and red as high visible colors. And we just wanted people to see it, see the name, see what it was, and see the phone number and give us a call. And we just focused on being as bright as we could, as big as we could, and in the middle of as many people as we could. There it is from the freeway. This is what you could see when you were traveling on I-94 from downtown Chicago out to O'Hare. You could see our trade name, Acorn Self-Storage, and This was a later iteration. We put indoor self-storage because we didn't have any windows showing what the building was and the phone number. And we were a pretty big billboard out there in '94. When we built this place, we put in some things that were brand new. We put in a drive-through loading area. Something like this never existed anywhere in Chicago, at least at the time. This was a drive-through area that you could drive in, park your car or truck. It was high enough for a car or truck to get into. And in a second, you'll see this next slide. We put a lift in, believing that if people were coming with trucks and they couldn't lift things, that this hydraulic lift would come up and you'd be able to take things out of the back of a car or a truck, and you'd lower it down to the floor. We put in freight elevators so you can bring your things in because we were 3 stories tall. There's an upper level of what it looked like. Back then, our construction in those days was precast construction. They didn't even make the painted metal storage partitions. We had this brush metal stuff that existed. There was only one company that made this kind of stuff at that time. It was all kind of flat metal. So I'm sure if I went back today, they've had to replace that because people have probably banged into it with carts, but that's what was available in the marketplace back in the day. So we built that property, just to give a little bit of history on that. Couple of interesting factoids. We financed that with an interest rate of 12.5% when we built that back in the early 1990s, because that's what the cost of money was. And we built that thing and we filled it up about 75% in about 18 months. So we had a very good reception, even though people couldn't see what the building was and people had to drive by and we had to give tours to everybody. And we had to explain to almost every customer coming in exactly what self-storage was and how it worked. We actually had 3 full-time managers there and we did a lot of explaining. But it worked and it was popular. And we were sort of on our way, and we were looking back at our other land holding that we had out in the suburbs, and it had grown. So as I showed you here, this was a rural property, and we had an old school row garage, non-climate controlled type storage facility that was cash flowing and just waiting for something else to go on. And this is what it became by 1990. We had built a shopping center on the majority of the property. We had a grocery anchored shopping center. And the self-storage facility was still existing. And we had a goal, though. We had a goal of expanding the shopping center. We wanted it to be larger. And the whole point of having the storage facility, again, was actually a land holding position. But we didn't want to get rid of our self-storage facility because self-storage was doing very well. We really were enamored with self-storage. The shopping center business became kind of tough, and we had some difficulties with it. Just to give you an idea, here's our plan of what this property was. So this is the shopping center property, and this was the storage building right here. And over in the bottom right corner, we owned other property over here, and that's where we wanted to move it because we wanted to create this, which was a redone shopping center. We were going to put in a large Walmart, and we were going to open up the shopping center out to the main street over there on the left-hand side of the page. And yet we didn't want to lose our self-storage business. We really liked it. So we had other land available. So there we were, there's our shopping center, and there's our old school self-storage facility. And our original plan was to go in that back corner. If you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, it says original location. That's where we were going to put the diagonal lines. You see there were high power tension power lines going through, those big giant towers carrying electric lines. So that's what that diagonal property is. But originally we were going to put our self-storage in the back. Why? Well, we had concerns about the zoning. We thought that they weren't going to allow us to do what we wanted to do. And we felt that in the early 1990s, the goal of putting these things in was to get the right zoning, to make them look like offices, kind of mask what they were a little bit, and make them compatible with your surrounding area so your community would allow you the type of zoning that you need. And we really weren't concerned as much about the visibility of the storage. As you see, our old property was a row garage, long, narrow. You really didn't see much off of the road over there. And we did very, very well with that. And we weren't fairly concerned. So we were going to put it in the back. But I was a new young pup in the business, and I really convinced my father that hiding in the back was a bit of a mistake. It was tough to get people back there. We had a tough position of trying to get the road back to that property. And so we worked with it. We worked with some design. So back in that back corner, that was our first original design. The idea, again, blending with the zoning, trying to make the buildings, those high-rise buildings were actually storage buildings with reflective fake glass there. We had ground level storage. You had all those buildings were designed with the upper level multi-story storage buildings. And then the front buildings were designed to be office warehouse, a flexible additional use that we were going to add to it. And it was actually a very interesting design, a nice complex, but I personally became very fearful that the storage business was becoming more competitive, and yet customers still didn't quite understanding how much time I spent with my managers of my property in Chicago and explaining what storage was and showing them what storage was. And when they didn't see the doors, which is a big mantra in the business, to see the doors. Remember public storage, and I showed you in California, how they showed all those orange doors. The orange doors in California was a very ubiquitous thing. So seeing the doors, knowing what the business was very, very important. My father wanted to blend more in the community. He was a longtime property owner in this community. He was more about trying to develop this. And so we compromised and we tried to develop that. That was our second iteration. This was lowering this down. Our drives that you look, those little U-shaped things, the idea there was you could drive a car or a truck to an upper level. I was concerned about direct access into the storage. So we redesigned the property so there was more direct access. There was actually a drive-through tunnel inside this building, the U-shaped thing in the back near the diamond in the middle. That was a ramp that went to the upper level, so you could drive to the upper level and have a loading area in the upper level. And we retained the idea of the use of the office warehouse. There was other office warehouse use in this particular area, and we thought that that would be a good later iteration and be acceptable to the community. We also mixed the use that we had. And the back behind this building shows non-climate controlled, regular old storage that didn't carry such a high cost to run or such a high price to rent. So we started mixing the uses. That was the worry that we had there. So moving on, this is again where we started, and that was our original location. And so I was finally successful in convincing my father to move the location. That was where our final site wound up. Since we had high profile visibility, again, I mentioned the high powered lines that bifurcate, you see the diagonal there was nothing blocking that. Our visibility was very, very high. I was concerned about the visibility. I was concerned about people understanding what it was. We were planning on building a pretty new and sophisticated property, and it was in 1990. It was a very, very early time for these kinds of properties to go. So we decided to get up front and pay attention to that mantra of retail type location and really put it in the face of everybody and have people understand what this thing was. So this was our final design of what we ended up with. So that was our rendering of what we were planning on doing. And that was the actual property that we actually built. And so it looked pretty similar to that rendering. You can see the property in the back that we did not build on. This thing was a mostly indoor, mostly climate controlled property. We selected red, not so much to mimic public storage, but somewhat to mimic public storage to really just grab the visibility. You can see those roofs from the road, from the air, from everywhere when you go out and see that property. And much of this property was indoor climate controlled. So you can see you don't see doors. That was a big concern that I have. You don't see the self-storage doors. The individual doors are a big marketing aspect that people understand, and it's very recognizable by anybody that drives by. And again, in the early 1990s, it wasn't not as well known, and we were in a suburban, it was rural, now becoming suburban, ex-urban type of marketplace. So this was a true third generation property that we had built. High on the aesthetics. Here's the rendering of what we were building. And here's the front of how it really built. This is actually, we work with the land that was actually the retention basin for the whole property. The property was spread across about 7 acres. We actually had to positively charge that water, so we'd always have a fountain going. My father was always irked by that fountain. He wanted to be more decorative and spewing out water because he viewed that as being an eye grabber. But you can see with the somewhat garish colors of black and red and white, it really grabbed attention off the road and people saw what it was. But again, you don't see the storage doors, and I was concerned about people understanding exactly what this was because it was a relatively new concept at the time. And here's some pictures of it. So the idea here is you see number 3, that was one of the drive-in areas. You'd drive a car, truck come into there, you'd stop, you'd open that large high bay door and drive inside. We had some units that were accessible right from the outside. Those were actually heated and air conditioned units that were accessible from the outside. As you can see, here's how it worked inside. This is inside one of those drives. We actually built these drives high enough and wide enough for two-way passage of vehicles, high enough for all size trucks to get inside, and yet you could still access the units directly, because our feeling was that's what customers really wanted. They didn't want to go vertical in the suburbs. They wanted to be able to drive right up to the units. Now, we were very fearful of going vertical, even though we did it successfully in the city. We were very fearful of getting into the suburbs. The suburbs were used to single level, direct access, and we own the land. We could make the decision to do it since we were able to do that, even though it was more expensive to build. We felt that this was going to be well received in this community that had a growing demographic in terms of its household income and such. We felt that this was going to be well received in this community. And here's just some more pictures. There's some outdoor regular storage stuff, if you will. And then even this, if you note, we even built some outdoor climate controlled stuff. This was actually heated and air conditioned right from the outside. So we had insulated doors, which was a mistake. Things that we learned, the amount of bleed and loss that we had to heat and air in this thing was enormous. Our utility bills were out of control and enormous. And we learned a lot of errors, but we did a lot of interesting things right in this. So we built the first true third generation storage. And we knew we did a lot of things right because we won a bunch of awards for this property. So back in 1991, we won a Facility of the Year for excellence in self-storage development. And a couple of years later, our managers won Managers of the Year. The Mini Storage Messenger is still the primary magazine that exists in the industry. And they were selected as winners of Managers of the Year. We spent a year and a half looking for this couple that we felt were the right kind of salespeople and the right kind of people to run this type of property for us. So what happened for me was we ran into some difficulty with other properties that we had, and I was not a believer of the self-storage business, but the self-storage business, as I mentioned, in the 1990s was really in flux. It was very difficult to develop it. I believed in the business, but we were working as mom and pops and small operators, and getting capital and expanding was a very difficult process. And it just looked like it was something that wasn't going to go on. And so I was moving on. And so I moved on to new places and new opportunities here to Michigan. So I was in Michigan working for several other companies, doing some very high profile, larger non-storage projects. But the itch came back after about 10 years. So in 2005, I went back to the future. And I met an individual who had a business park that wasn't doing very well. And this is up in Orion Township, actually right near the old Palace of Auburn Hills. And he was having a pretty failed business park. This is a bit of a picture I tried to put together back in the day. He had one building on your left-hand side that was built and for lease, and it had been for lease for 5 years. He was not too far with this property from the Orion GM plant. And during the late 1990s, there was a cash crunch and the auto business wasn't doing all that great, and things just slowed down. So he had built the first building, and the other building, he had started a structure and let it sit. And he and I met, and he was looking for some use for his industrial buildings. I was looking to get back into the storage business, and I saw the high profile nature of Lapeer Road. I looked at the marketplace up there, felt that the marketplace was not there yet in Orion and Rochester and those areas, and felt that that was a coming market and that we would do pretty well with a limited size storage facility. So this is what we started with. That's what it began. It was going to be a 1-story light duty industrial building. And that was when I picked it up with him. That was before, and that's what it became after. So we redeveloped this thing into a 2-story climate controlled property. A couple of things that I had learned, lessons learned after my many years of being in storage. I mixed this is some non-climate controlled stuff, direct access in the back, but I limited how much was there. But I put some in. Again, you want to mix up the types of spaces that you have in these properties to appeal to different customer needs. We built what I refer to as a dock box. So instead of building those long drives the way I did in the suburban Mundelein property, and we bled a lot of heat and air out of those things, we put a combined but fairly large, roughly 6,000 square foot loading area that cars or trucks could drive inside into. They would drive inside, park and unload their things. And this would be the central area. And you could see the elevator. One of my bitter defeats in my disputes with my partners, I wanted 2 elevators. We only put in 1 elevator. It turned out to work fine in this particular property. It gave me an idea of the limitations or expanse of how much you could plan for elevator usage. We clocked how much square footage, how often it was used, and got a good gauge of really when you need to put in additional elevators, which is a big development cost when you put these things in. But this property operated very, very well with just the 1 elevator. So this is just what it looked like inside. Really paid attention to the clean, neat aesthetics of the inside. We had lights that were on timers. We had a lot of security features baked into this thing. Learned a lot of things about how to do these things correctly in my earlier years. Again, this is our dock box, as I call it. We use heat tubes in there. It's a low-cost way of heating inside because there's doors open and close in the dead of winter. Gives you an idea of the size of this thing. The largest over-the-road size truck could fit inside of this dock, and that's how we had designed this thing to get maximum potential usage. So we put in, enhanced retail, like I showed in earlier things. Here's the office. We actually had redesigned this thing fairly recently. Had sort of what we called an industrial chic look to it. Didn't put a lot of signs, didn't put a lot of garbage here. We wanted it neat and clean because the sales office is where the image comes from the people who walk in, and that image is sold when they first walk in and when they're last about to sign up. And it's really important that they have the image of being clean, neat, professional, something attractive, because the industry in and of itself and the use of self-storage in and of itself is not something somebody really wants to do. Nobody wants to go pick up heavy things and spend hours moving things from point A to point B. So you have to have an impression when they're here that it's very nice, it's very friendly, it's very easy to use, it's very clean and neat, and that's a big part of selling what you're selling. And again, another view of what the office is. Learn to set up a nice looking presence. And so one thing to tell you about this is we built this thing in 2005, and we did nicely. We filled up about 1/3 of the property in the first 8 months. Unfortunately, our timing was a little rough because in 2005, it was just fine in Michigan. But in Michigan, for those who remember, by 2006, 2007, suppliers were shutting down. They were offering buyouts to auto people. There was a lot of disruption beginning to brew in about 2006, 2007 here in Michigan. So while we raced up to about 1/3 full, it took us another year to get to be 50% full. We were breaking even, but we were really lagging with this property, and it was very difficult because of the recession. As I said, storage has had its downturns, and we were having a tough time absorbing. Michigan had a lot more outflow of people than inflow. We remember the days when people would come in and they told us they were all moving down to Kentucky. Everybody seemed to be moving to Kentucky or Florida. Everybody was moving. They were taking buyouts, moving, leaving. And while there was some storage activity, it's not as much storage activity as you have when the economy is booming and going positively. When they're losing their jobs and they're looking to leave, they're looking to cut their costs or looking to keep their costs down. And that's the negative side of storage. So it took a while for us to build that property up. We bounced along for quite a few years. By the time we took 2008 and 2009, we were stabilized, but we were not really making a lot in way of profit. It wasn't doing great. We learned that we turned our way out of the recession by about 2010, 2011. That property, which was about 55,000 square feet net rentable, it started to lease up, and we were about 98, 99% leased by the time we hit 2011, and it was booming. And we were raising rates, and we were doing great. And we were still in a time when most people were still feeling like they were pulling out of the recession. But we were feeling very good that we delivered the right product in the right situation. The only thing that was a problem was the industry, as I've shown on previous graphs, was growing. And the expectation in the industry was growing. And the expectation from buyers, those being REITs and private equity buyers, was expanding. They were looking for properties that were much larger than 55,000 square feet. They were going from a basis of wanting to buy 55,000 feet to more like 65, 75, maybe 85,000 square feet. And we were considered undersized. And so I went to my partnership group and I said, guys, we are doing extremely well. And everybody was pleased and everybody was pocketing money and we all loved it. The problem was we were going to be hurt on a sales basis with that property. It was undersized for what the real buyers really wanted. And I said, we have to make a choice. We either have to sell and make an okay profit or we have to grow. That was the decision. We had to get of the size that the industry was looking for in order to make an exit strategy out of the property. So we came upon this. So if you look at the left-hand side property, that's an aerial of the original property that we built. And it says drive inside dock number 1. Then what we decided to do was we had to grow, and the way we were going to grow was buying the building next door. So the building next door was only half occupied. It was not in very good shape. It was the oldest building in the business park. It wasn't very high in terms of its height, but we spent a lot of time analyzing and looking at the building and trying to determine what can we do. So borrowing from the playbook of some of those eras that I've talked about, we decided to do a couple of different things with this secondary building. So we learned some lessons. So here's the secondary building. It was just sort of a general purpose, kind of low-rise industrial building. It was actually set up for a multi-tenant office building. And we gutted out the building. There's construction. So one of the first things we decided to do, we thought we could just buy the building, and in keeping our costs down, we could just make it an easy to access from the outdoor building. We just create a door from the outside and people could just access it. And we really turned and twisted over this because remember, we were coming out of the recession. It was a difficult choice to make. We thought that one of the things we were doing was being smart by just doing it in a low-cost way, and we could vary our pricing structure by offering high-end pricing in our original property and lower-end pricing in our second property. But we came to a final conclusion and analysis that we were who we were. We decided we had to be who our identity was, and we were the A-class primary climate-controlled drive-in side A-class property in the marketplace. And if we were really going to sell to somebody, then the thing we had to do was to double down and become more of who we were. So we took this building, we added another dock component, just like we had in the other one. We made it even larger than the last one. You see here, we cleared out the building and we diamond etched the floors. So we had a nice finish on the floor. We learned our lessons by not painting floors. You could acid etch your painted floors, but over time they tend to wear down and it's hard to repaint. It's hard on a CapEx basis to improve floors that have lots of partitions built all over the place. So we diamond etched all of our floors and made sure we had a nice, pretty, beautiful floor. And we started subdividing the building. Now, in this case, we decided to borrow again a playbook from some of the mixed-use self-storage projects. And what we did was we found a lease. We found a tenant to put in the building. So it wasn't all self-storage. It was a bit of a mixed use. So here's our large dock. This was larger than our other one, a little bit larger, a little bit better oriented. One thing I point out is that blue door. We made a larger entrance door. We found a good supplier to put a door in off of the dock there. So it was much larger than the original one that we had, which was a little sliding glass door. But here's our tenant. We found a dance studio that had insufficient space in the marketplace. They were looking to grow. They had a long-term history. They were doing very well. They didn't need frontage along the major road. They just needed a good parking lot and a good place to access. So we took the one end of the building and we built out the dance studio. They already had a baked-in customer base, and that was an immediate rent-paying tenant, which was a great help to us as we ended up doing this project. We were able to borrow 100% of all purchase price and development costs against the original building and the plan for the second building. So the business plan plus our cash flow from the other one made it such that we did not have to put $1 of additional equity into this deal. Getting some early cash flow from the dance studio really helped us. So we borrowed a page from that playbook and learning that lesson and putting in a dance studio. We also put in, and it's a little hard from this picture, it's the only decent picture I could show, it's a little hard to show on the other end of the building, we created some hybrid small office warehouse spaces. This is looking into one of them. The idea was we created a drive-in side area where you could load from the rear inside into these office warehouse units. And each of the office warehouse units had outdoor front door access or access for cars to park right in front of their office space. So we took the outside areas and we sort of just subdivided around the inside, and we created these three small office warehouse units. And then inside we had a couple of storage units because we had some extra room. So we created some indoor storage units. And I'm sorry, I've lost my space on this slide. And so we created on one end a pre-leased dance studio. On the other end, we had office warehouse. In the middle, we had the additional self-storage. And that was some of the lessons learned. Hopefully some of the words and some of the examples I told you dovetailed into some of those areas that I told you about. Now, just briefly, I'm just finishing up here. We get into the post-COVID era, which I didn't talk about in the era in storage. So I'm going to point to some of these lists here. Now, this is all the REITs and some of the REIT types. And when you look here, it says COVID-19 sensitivity. And you can see the ones that were highly sensitive: hotels, casinos, malls, shopping centers. You move down the list, the ones that were low sensitivity to COVID, that they didn't have impacts from COVID, self-storage, low. In the middle, general economic sensitivity. Was this, what's susceptible to the economy being good or bad? Again, hotels, malls. You can see industrial has a medium impact, but storage, again, stable, consistently used. Your general economic sensitivity to storage, impact low. The one thing, though, that we have is rate sensitivity. Self-storage and the investment and the valuation of self-storage extremely sensitive to interest rates. So right now we're entering an era now with interest rates rising and rising very fast, that storage, while it was extremely popular in the last couple of years, right now is getting into a little bit of a hold period, because there isn't a clear answer as to whether people are going to raise interest rates and therefore increase their NOI enough to overcome the change in interest rates that you're going to have to pay in order to buy. So as we get into post-COVID, though, what people believe in the post-COVID environment, you can see this is a forward-looking, that they believe that there's going to be a growth in revenues from current stage. I guess we're in 2021 to 2026. They're forecasting almost 5.5% growth, compound average growth rate of revenues. They're expecting revenues still to grow in storage. One thing that COVID exposed is a lot of people moved and a lot of people used storage, and there was a bit of a snob factor that was overcome during the COVID time period. The snob factor being there were a lot of people who didn't use self-storage before. They always thought that was for somebody else. And with all the people moving, locating temporarily to different locations, expanding their homes or closing their offices permanently and having to put things away, there was just a huge rush of use of self-storage. And a lot of people who didn't use self-storage started using self-storage. There is a belief in the industry that the average utilization rate, that average now that's 7 to about 15 square feet per person in marketplaces, we're reaching a new plateau, and we're going to stay at that new plateau because a lot of people were introduced to storage during the COVID time period. COVID was an enormous boon to demand. And here's just the forecasts of looking at COVID, and you can see what the forecasts and what the past were. So you can see the dip of what went on. There certainly was a dip during COVID in terms of the revenues in the business, but the expectation was, and you can see where the bump came in 2021. There was a huge bump. There was a huge rush of demand. Now we're going to fall back down a little bit. But from this point forward, from 2022 going forward, there is a belief that the business is sophisticated enough, it understands the absorption, it understands what it's doing, that it's going to have a nice continual rise and will continue performing well in the public sectors, the private sectors, and even amongst the mom and pops. So that's a bit about COVID, a bit about about self-storage, a bit about my examples in self-storage. I hope you've got a good general sense of the business and where it sits and how it operates and why it's different and what the good and the bad and the ugly is. I'm available to talk to anybody who wants to discuss self-storage. I do consulting and development on my own. I'm always interested in talking to people who want to be involved in the business. Right now, I'm just passing through some memes. If you get a chance to read some of these cartoons, the business is so big that there's actually hundreds of memes online about self-storage. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk with everybody, and go and rent yourself some extra space.